Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for bearing with us while we got the stream back up and running. We had a few technical glitches, but hopefully that will be the last of them. My name is Amelia. I am a committee member of the SA Warmblood Horse Society, and on behalf of everyone else, would just like to welcome you to this talk. So, to get right into it, right beside me is Dr. Mareli Smalberger. She is a veterinarian qualified in January 2021. She's previously completed a BSc and an MSc in agriculture and animal nutrition, and went on to do her equivalent was a Zuma year in Cape Town. And she has recently, well, as of April this year, started an internship at Glen Austin Clinic and at Equicare here in Midrand. So she is also a horse rider herself. She competes in the dressage field and has trained her own horse up to the FEI small tour level. So we're really excited to have you here with us and learn some more. So thank you for sharing with us. Please feel free to add in anything else I might have missed out about you. There was a lot. But yeah, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I'm honoured and excited to be presenting to you all this evening. So, firstly, like Amelia said, I am a horse lover, a warm blood lover, and a dressage rider. So this project came from a place of concern because I couldn't imagine the heartbreak of having a foal born affected with this condition. But I'm also a scientist who had the opportunity and means to find answers to this condition. And to answer the question, what is the significance of fragile foal syndrome in South Africa? This was a question I asked at our Equine Vet Congress 3 years ago, and no one could give me an answer. So I chose this topic for my final year research project under the guidance of Prof. Alan Guthrie at the Equine Research Centre at Honest Let's look at the outline of our presentation this evening. So first I'll be looking at what fragile foal syndrome is, why it's important, what are the clinical signs, a little segue into genetics of fragile foal syndrome, and then why is it an issue now? We'll also be looking at some skin fragility syndromes in other species, and then we'll get to the study that I did. And we'll also discuss the present and future of fragile foal syndrome. So, what is fragile foal syndrome? It was previously known as warm blood fragile foal syndrome. However, it's recently been discovered in several other breeds, and it's also been discovered that it's present in thoroughbreds without any influence or any warm blood lines in their genetics. So the first affected thoroughbred foal was recently described. It is a recessive genetic condition that disrupts collagen synthesis in the body. So affected foals cannot survive. They have very fragile skin and often have skeletal deformities. So why is fragile foal syndrome important? Firstly, it is a loss to breeders. A non-viable foal is born at the end of investing a lot of time and effort into a pregnancy, not to mention the breeding costs, the vet bills, and the emotional investment, especially in some of our more boutique studs in South Africa. The South African equine industry is a multi-million rand industry, and South Africa has seen the importation of over 1,000 high-quality warm bloods over the past decade or two. And this has improved our national herd dramatically. We also have carrier semen available, or had carrier semen available to South African breeders in the past, and we have several stallions standing at stud that are offspring of confirmed carriers. So we can't exclude carriers in South Africa. Let's look at mares carrying affected foals often have late-term abortions. They can have difficult births or dystochias. There's also been a small study showing that these foals may be born prematurely or you get a stillbirth of a foal at term, or a weak foal that needs to be euthanized within hours of being born. Let's have a look at the clinical signs. So here we can see the difference between an affected foal A and a normal foal B. So the affected foal, I'm sure you can appreciate, has a much thinner skin structure and a much more disorganized skin structure than a normal foal would have. And this is due to abnormal collagen linkage in the skin. And this also leads to hematomas, incomplete closure of skin, and then not all foals are equally affected. Some foals will only have a tail affected or no visible signs. However, the foals are just really weak and unable to survive. And here you can see some of the skin lesions that affected foals have. And they may also have skeletal deformities and joint laxity and joint hypermobility, especially in the distal limbs, and they can also have spinal malformation in some cases. So the PLOD1 gene has this very long and complicated name, but it's easier just to say it's the PLOD1 gene. And to describe what's happening here, it is a single nucleotide polymorphism. So one of the nucleotides on the DNA is swapped out and to a different nucleotide. And this leads to amino acid change in the protein that's expressed. And that protein that's expressed is collagen. So you have altered collagen in your skin and everywhere in the body. Collagen is found not just in skin, it's found in joints and bones, and this leads to these weak foals. Let's have a look at how fragile foal syndrome is inherited. If you mate two clear parents with each other, you will have 100% clear offspring or unaffected offspring. However, if you mate a clear parent to a carrier parent, you will have a 50% chance of having clear foals and a 50% chance of having carrier foals. However, if you mate two carriers with each other, you have a 25% chance of having a clear foal, a 50% chance of having carrier foals, and then unfortunately a 25% chance of having an affected foal, and this is a lethal condition. So why has fragile foal syndrome only been discovered now? Firstly, it's due to the mode of inheritance, this recessive mode of inheritance that we don't see it so commonly. And secondly, it's due to the presentation of these foals. Because we think quite a few of the foals are lost during late-term abortions, and 25% of abortions have no known cause, and a further 25% of abortions assume that the deformities are the sole reason for the abortion with no genetic component. We've also recently seen breeding for increased limb flexibility, especially in the dressage lines, and we've also seen some prolific sires that are all carriers of fragile foal syndrome. Let's have a look at some of the history of fragile foal syndrome. It was discovered in 2011, and the first affected wombat foal was found in 2015, with furthermore foals studied in 2019, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the first thoroughbred foal was discovered last year, or described last year. However, this condition can be traced back to hundreds of years. In the Hanoverians, they have found the most recent common ancestor in 1861, and there's also been case descriptions from the 1600s where they found similar conditions. However, these are not exclusively fragile foal syndrome. And then two very famous stallions, which are these two horses in the pictures, are Dark Ronald, who is a thoroughbred, and Barakta, who's a Arabian stallion. They were implicated at some stage, but their remains were tested and they're not the source of the condition. So we actually don't know where it comes from. And then we look at skin fragility syndromes across species. In humans, there are several mutations, and type 6 is similar to fragile foal syndrome. It's Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And then there are also similar syndromes in several other species. We're also going to look at other skin fragility in equines. So junctional epidermolysis bullosa is one. However, this condition can present quite similarly to fragile foal syndrome, but it's more in your draft breeds, so your Belgian draft breeds. And these horses do not have the, they don't share any DNA really with the warm bloods. There's not really been any inbreeding with the warm bloods, so it's unlikely that this is related to fragile foal syndrome. And then also a little bit more well-known one is Harda, which is a mutation of the PPIB gene, which occurs in quarter horses, paints, and Appaloosas. And this you see much later in life, normally when they start being ridden and they find loose skin on the saddle and bruising over the saddle area. In terms of testing, commercial testing has been available overseas since 2013. It's only really became popular from 2015 to 2018 when a breeder found a affected foal and wanted to investigate more. But there are tests in several other countries. However, there's been no testing in South Africa, there's been no test available, and there's been no research done before now. There's also mandatory and voluntary testing schemes of stallions, both in the USA and in several EU countries, and several stud books also have mandatory testing of their stallions. So now let's have a quick look at the study I did. So the aim was to design a PCR test that's optimized for carriers of fragile foal syndrome, and then to utilize this test in a study to determine what the carrier frequency of a population of warm bloods in South Africa is, and to look at whether there's any need for further research in this field. And the objective was to verify this test with DNA from known carriers, and then to test a targeted warm blood population to establish the frequency. And just a very quick look at the materials and methods. They're much more complicated, and there's a lot more detail, but I'm really just going to go over the very basics. So firstly, we did an initial study, which we had semen from 2 known carriers, which was our positive control, and then we had offspring of 18 carrier size, including 1 known negative, 1 known non-carrier, which served as our negative control. We sequenced their DNAs, and we tested this against the thoroughbred genome to rule out any other genetic mutations in that area of the gene. And then in our biggest study, we used 110 warm bloods. So just to stress, all of these horses are completely anonymized, and 82 of them were breeding stallions that were historic or current, I don't know, with no suspicion of fragile foal syndrome in their pedigree, as well as 28 stallions, mares and geldings with known or suspected carriers in their parentage, and that included the 18 horses that we used in the smaller study, and they were the control for our larger study. Now we get to the results. And I found that 19% of horses tested were carriers in South Africa. So to determine the allele frequency, this is how research papers normally translate that number. For us, it's an easy thing. You take 19, you divide it by 2, you get 9.5%. We don't have to go into any more complicated maths, such as on the slide. To go further, we break down this carrier frequency. Among the individuals with suspicion of fragile foal syndrome in their pedigree, 53% were carriers. And among the stallions without any suspicion of fragile foal syndrome in their pedigree, we found 7% were carriers. And of those 7%, one stallion was locally bred, indicating that it already had spread to our local warm-blooded population. And then we look at the carrier frequency in different disciplines. 24% of our carriers were horses in dressage blood from dressage breeding, 15% of carriers were from jumping bloodlines, and 22% were from dual-purpose bloodlines. If we look at the discussion, I just want to stress that since this was a pilot study, it was only we only used a small sample size, and the results I found does not necessarily reflect the results of the country as a whole. And that's why further research is needed to establish what the carrier frequency is in the entire country's population, as opposed to the small study that I did just to establish the test. And it lays a basis for further research in fragile foal syndrome in South Africa. And as yet, we don't know of any affected foals being born in the country. So if we look at the comparison of the results from South Africa to other countries, we're very similar to Germany, also have a 9.5% carrier frequency. Brazil is a bit lower, and then a bit higher in the USA. And in the Hanoverian population in Germany, the amounts of carriers go up to about 14%. And if we look at our incidence in the targeted population, so where we found the 53% were carriers, this is sort of predicted if we think back about the side of genetic inheritance, where we say there's a 50% chance of having a carrier if you mate in carriers. So that 53% sort of was predicted by that. And then in the study of affected foals, they found that almost all the foals that were suspected affected were affected. And then in terms of the carrier status being related to discipline, where we found the 24% of carriers in dressage lines versus 15% in jumping lines, the increased amount of carriers in dressage is probably related to the emphasis of breeding for increased limb flexibility, as this has been seen as an early indicator of dressage performance. And it's closely correlated to fragile foal syndrome gene on the chromosome. So the increased limb flexibility and the fragile foal syndrome gene sit very close to each other, so often when meiosis occurs, these two genes can move together. So that's why we think that the increased flexibility is correlated to the fragile foal syndrome gene. And the other reason is that prolific sires have been carriers. And it's due to the popular sire phenomenon. Everyone likes there's a sire that performs really well, everyone likes him, everyone uses him, and if he is a carrier, he just spreads the condition much further. We've also had several Hanoverian Stallion of the Year stallions or winners that were carriers. In fact, the 2011, 2012 and 2013 Stallion of the Year winners were all carriers of Fragile Foal syndrome. Hence probably why a few years later, or a year or so later, there was this explosion of Fragile Foal syndrome in the public eye. And in the Hanoverian breed, there's been up to a 24% carrier frequency amongst certain populations. And the F and W lines of Hanoverian breeding has been associated with the Fragile Foal syndrome gene, but it's not just the F line, there are other lines as well that have been implicated. It's just in terms of research done up to date. In terms of breeding, selection and performance, this is brand new research. So earlier in the year, there was a study done on Swedish warm bloods, and it was quite a large study. They used over 2,200 horses, and they looked at over 50 years of data. They found that the least amount of carriers were born in the first cohort in the 1970s, and the most amount of carriers were born most recently from 2016 onwards. And they found, in addition to looking at conformation and different conformation associated with Fragile Foal syndrome, they found that Fragile Foal syndrome carriers have more cadence, increased stride length, better suppleness and better elasticity in all three gaits, but the most improvement was seen in the walk. So maybe if you want to better walk, maybe you should use a carrier stallion. I don't know. They also have said, though, that more research is needed to look at this and to see whether the increase in performance is really related to the carriers or whether it's just closely related on the chromosome. And they've also used a modeling system to see how they can reduce the incidence of Fragile Foal syndrome in a population. And what they proposed is to allow the high quality carrier stallions, so your top 10% of best stallions, into a breeding program, even if they're carriers, and that will maintain your breeding goal, and then the gene frequency will slowly decrease in a population over time. Whereas non-selective breeding might lead to affected foals or an increase in carriers. So if you want to breed with a carrier, just breed carefully and think why you'd like to breed with this horse and what attributes he will have. In terms of carrier distribution, in our study population without any Fragile Foal suspicion in their pedigrees, we saw that 7% were carriers and then the one that's been locally bred. So it's important just to note that we've had one that's locally bred. It just means that it's already spread into our local warm blood population. And it's also important because warm bloods are often crossed out with several other breeds, so Appaloosas, Thoroughbreds, Irish sport horses, and then Iberian breeds as well, but there's a long list of sport horses where warm bloods are utilized. And this can then spread the condition to other breeds. And in other related breeds, we found a very low frequency in Irish sport horses as well as in thoroughbreds, and then the condition has not been identified in pony breeds such as Connemara's and Shetlands, and it's also not been identified in your cold-blooded breeds like Shires and Frisians. And in South Africa, we have a strong thoroughbred influence in our mare lines. So a lot of our foundation mares have been crossed with thoroughbreds, and that's likely protected our local breeding stock from seeing an even higher incidence of fragile foal syndrome, as a lot of the mare lines contain that thoroughbred influence. I mean, it's starting to change now with a lot of the imports, but that's on our foundation stock. And now let's look at the summary take-home message. We have confirmed carrier stallions available to breeders, or we've had them available in the past, and we have offspring of confirmed carriers standing at stud and available to breeders. So it's imperative for breeders to test all of the breeding stock, both your stallions and your mares, because if you breed a carrier to a carrier, you have that 25% chance of breeding an affected foal. And as I said, affected foals are not able to survive, and there are abortions late in pregnancy, so you've already put all the effort in the pregnancy. And the other thing I really want everyone to take home is we should not have any stigma on these stallions, because some of the best stallions in the world are carriers, and as this recent study has shown, they might even be advantageous to your breeding goal. And we also need to get on board with the overseas breeding federations, because a lot of their stallions have the status known. So if you have recognized any of the stallions I used in my talk this evening, I don't want to name them or anything. If you want to know whether a stallion is a carrier, you can simply look them up online. And we'd like a similar openness in our local warm blood breeding population. And if you do have a suspect case, or if you're wondering about a foal, please contact me. And I know it's how hard it is, but if you could take pictures or samples, you've got EDTA blood samples, and as well as skin from the foal for histopathology, and the same for abortions. Then we get to the actual test that's now available, and to people who have submitted tests in the past. We finally got it all up and running as from tonight, and this week the submission form is correct. I'll also let Francis maybe send out the form to everyone who's interested, and the test will cost 520 Rand if you just want to test for fragile foal syndrome, or 320 Rand if you've already sent in DNA. So I think most of the breeders have sent hair samples in the past. So if you've sent hair samples to the genetics lab, then just contact us, but we should have you on file already, and then you only need to pay 320 Rand. And in terms of whether we prefer blood samples or hair samples, we only prefer a blood sample if your horse has never been tested and you only want to test for fragile foal syndrome and you don't want to do the DNA profiling. And otherwise, a hair sample is fine. And in conclusion, fragile foal syndrome is present in South Africa. We have a test available, and a prevalence study could establish the allele frequency in our local population, and then we'll be following in several European countries' footsteps and the USA's footsteps in terms of getting mandatory testing of stallions, because we need interventions to curb the spread of this condition. And if you'd like to contact me in terms of sample submission, you're welcome to contact the Veterinary Genetics Lab at Honest to Poet. And if you've got any queries, you can contact me. And please, if you do send samples in, if you could CC me in fragilefoalsa@gmail.com into your email to them, and then I'll know to look for this, because I would like to take this further and to do a larger study and find out what the prevalence is in the whole of the warm blood population, but for that I would need your help. Thank you so much. And do you have any questions?
Thank you so much for that. That was
Pleasure.
really informative and exciting, and it's nice to see that we have some really relevant research that I think is possibly before its time, but I think that's to the advantage of the warm bloods here in South Africa, the whole equine industry here in South Africa. So it's amazing that we're kind of ahead of it rather than behind it.
Yes, for sure.
So thank you for that. I've got a few questions that have come through.
Yes.
The first one was from Lizzie. It was answered, but I think I'll ask it again because I think it is a really important point. Is that, regarding the evidence to suggest that carriers are hypermobile and very flexible. Sorry.
Yeah. So that's what like I said, the genes encoding for flexibility and the genes encoding for fragile foal syndrome are very close to each other on the chromosome. So when the genetics are all shuffling when they're making during meiosis, it's likely that the genes for encoding for hyperflexibility will go together with the genes encoding for fragile foal syndrome. So there's not unequivocal evidence that carriers are hypermobile. There may be non-carriers that are also hypermobile. It just depends on how the genes reassort.
So essentially, to get to the bottom of that, I suppose we'd have to do a lot more research into and break down the
for sure.
whole equine DNA.
Yes, break down the equine genome.
That's the one I was looking for. I suppose maybe in a few years we will have that, and that'll be very interesting.
I'm sure, because there's a lot of countries doing a lot of research now, and it would be really great to get on that bandwagon and get South Africa part of that research.
Yeah, makes breeding a lot less potentially. Maybe more accurate. You can potentially breed more for what you want if we get to the bottom of that, but I suppose time will tell.
Yes, sure.
Okay, so Francis was also asking, have there already been requests for testing done on foals from our breeders in South Africa, or?
So we haven't had any requests to test foals, but we've had requests to test stallions. I've had actually quite a few people contact me, and like I say to those people, I am sorry, because up to now the testing and communication's been a little bit lacking, where now we've got a cohesive front going forward, and in terms of testing, it's going to be incorporated into the weekly testing, so you'll get your results much quicker as well.
That's super. So actually in line with that, we've got Sue asking, so we said, what samples do you need? You covered that in terms of either hair or blood. And that's great for, I know my stallion's had his blood sent in because we have to have that for the DNA. So, I mean, that's great that we get a discount if we've already got our DNA on the system. Fantastic. How long does it usually take to get the results?
The actual test is fairly fast. So it's sort of similar to the horse sickness results and so on. It can take like 1 or 2 weeks just to get the results done, and they like to do sort of batch testing because they take a whole plate of 96 wells, and running all of that for one test is a bit of a problem, so we want to try and sort of do it into little batches, but the batches don't necessarily all have to be for fragile foal syndrome.
So how long was that?
We won't hold you
to it.
I can't give you a straight answer, unfortunately. I've been working with a lab for a while.
Yeah.
And like I said, I'm hoping it'll be 2 weeks. Fingers crossed.
Okay. All right. Well, that's not 6 months, so that's okay.
No.
And it's nice to see as well. I think you mentioned that where our tests are actually cheaper than they are abroad. So that's pretty good going.
Yeah, no, for sure. We try and keep it economical.
And I think that is, I haven't seen any more comments coming in. I think people have a lot to take in, but also I think you've answered a lot of the questions on the way. I think most of those questions were actually answered as we went along.
Okay, fantastic.
So thank you so much, and hopefully we will have you back in a few months or years' time to hear of where we're going and how the results are going, and what we can do to protect the population, and potentially improve the population as well.
For sure, because I think the Warm Blood Society have now also said that they've proposed that all new stallions entering into the registry need to be tested, and then you can voluntarily decide if you want to test any of the existing stallions on the registry, which I think is fantastic. And like you said, we're getting ahead of this curve, and we are proactive in trying to prevent any foals born with this condition. Yeah.
And I think it's important, it's not a mandate at this stage, but we do see value in it. So we would recommend that breeders get their stallions tested, I think for themselves as well, but also I think it's also important that we emphasize that there shouldn't be any stigma around it, because I know that did happen in Europe with a stigma around it. But then again, at the same time, you're hearing about this hyperflexibility that's potentially passed on, whether it is connected to it directly or not. It's interesting because there's one stallion that I know of, and his progeny are incredibly flexible for the most of it. Are they all carriers? We don't know. It will be interesting to see further, because those are definite qualities that people want in sport horses.
Yeah, no, for sure. For sure. And time will tell.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. We have another question come in. So the question is, can you do FFS testing on a Hanoverian DNA result? I have DNA certificates for various horses I am using. Can you get this information from those? I don't think from the certificate.
So we need the actual DNA to test it. So if you did it with the veterinary genetics lab, we'll have the horse's DNA. But if you didn't do it with that, then we wouldn't be able to help you, unfortunately. But it's as easy as sending in a blood or a hair sample.
Yeah, I suppose you can kind of trace it backwards if you end up with a foal that you find out is a carrier, and if the mare's not a carrier, then obviously the stallion will be. Yeah. She's saying specifically Hanoverian DNA certificates. I don't think no.
Like I said, as long as if we have the DNA on file, yes, we'll be able to help you. But if it was done overseas, though, you might be able to contact one of those labs and find out, do a European test if they maybe have the DNA on file.
Yeah, and I suppose there isn't countries aren't communicating enough, but also I suppose there's kind of a limitation on how readily available you can make that information, and it's up to the owner themselves to choose.
Exactly, it's up to the owners to disclose that information. And that's also if you test on the form, it also says would you like to disclose this information to anyone or not. If you tick no one, it's completely confidential.
Yeah. And then a question that I had when we were thinking about this was, what about in regards to testing mares? Obviously they bring 50% of the genes into it, so...
No, for sure. You test all your mares, and then, if they're not carriers, you can breed them to any stallion you like. So, whereas if they're carriers, you should just breed them to stallions that are not carriers. So, that's for sure. Equally, testing of mares and stallions, it's equally important.
Yeah. I suppose that's interesting. You could Yeah.
If you
Worry about whether the stallion's positive, or just make sure that your mare's not a carrier, and then
yes, and then you can, because I think that a lot of the studs here are very mare based. You know, some studs don't even have any stallions. You only use semen, so then it's very worth it to test your mares and know what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay. Super. I think that is all the questions we have.
Okay.
Any closing comments from yourself?
Just again, this project has come from a place of love and a place of concern, and I just can't imagine the heartbreak of having a foal born with this condition if it's so easily prevented. And don't stigmatize it. It's just a gene. Carriers are completely phenotypically normal. They're fantastic performance horses. There's no reason not to use a carrier.
Yeah. Super. Well, thank you so much for your time. And we will put out your contact details as well, so that anybody can get in touch. And yeah, I hope we'll have a lot more information the next time we see you. So thank you so much on behalf of the SA Warm Horse Society. And yeah, we look forward to a future of a breed with not any fragile foals, or no fragile foal syndrome prevalent in it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for everyone for